Hi everyone, welcome to our Teardown section. Today we're going to have a look at this exterior countryside rendering. So let's get started. Let me get my pen. So we're going to start with composition as usual, I think. So the first thing I think that is kind of a problem is, like, you can see that we have the horizon line sitting sort of right in the middle of the image. I think I cropped it from earlier. Anyway, so I think it would be good to sort of add a little bit of sky, because the problem is here you can see that we're already cropping the top of a bit of our projects. So it's this, like, the principle is the same for every, like, it's the same as in architecture when you say you either have ID A or ID B, but you don't try to sort of merge them and have like a weird concept. Try to be strong in your position, if I may say. So here's the same. If you have your building that does this, you don't want to crop right before the top of the building. You either crop really before it or you crop on above it, and you have like sky or trees or whatever. But you be careful with the framing, because it is a bit of a problem when you stop at weird space or weird place in the project. It's a good thing because here we're going to have a bit more of a tree here, and especially more sky here, which is a good thing, I think. That way you have some sort of a directional thing that sort of brings you to the project here. The thing is, I think we have too many trees in front of our project, especially since we're dealing here with birch trees, and they're supposed to be extremely slender and high. So we could use that to have actually long trees. Like, you could have that many, but they would have to be a little bit higher, and the foliage or the leaves would have to start much higher so that you actually can see the project here. And then on the contrary, maybe you could have something a little bit more interesting on the ground, have maybe more variety in terms of a vegetation, so that you sort of create a nice framing with the trunk and the foliage. And in the same way, this is a little bit weird because it hides this sort of main part of the project, which is kind of a shame. And the other thing that is weird is that we only have birch trees everywhere, and for some reason these two guys here are completely different, and they're not really like that good looking, because I think it's mainly a problem in lighting, because you can see they're extremely dark and there's no variation in the leaves so that they could have catch light in an interesting way. So I would sort of stick to the birch trees, make them a little bit slender and higher, and sort of use them to frame your house here. Another thing that is a little bit not complicated, but not convincing here, is the sky itself. It's interesting to have, like, it looks like quite an overcast image, which is personally a kind of atmosphere that I really like. The thing is, you have to be careful that the lighting fits or matches the sky. So here we have, it sort of looks like an AGRI sky, so you might want to change it and have like a nice overcast sky. And the good thing with overcast sky is that they're actually just have to be, like, they could be almost purely white or light gray, and you can just see a little bit of clouds in it, but they're basically white, which means the colors will only come from your basically the surrounding in your projects. So it's really like a really interesting way of working, because contrary to working with like a blue sky, you're going to have really interesting light and like really soft shadows and some sort of just like ambient light. So I would change the sky for something, because here you can see it's extremely blurry and not defined, and that's kind of a shame. I'm not a huge fan of the birds here. I'm not sure they add anything to the story here, so I would, well, just be sure that you think they bring something. Last but not least is the backdrop here. It is extremely rare, not to say impossible, but extremely rare, that you actually have the horizon and you can see like nothing that goes above it. So usually you have a mountain or you have like a city or anything, but it is extremely rare to have nothing. So I would try to add a backdrop. It could be just like a tree, a line of trees, and the background much smaller, but something that sort of stops the eye. And the good thing is that if you bump in something at the end, it sort of leads your eye back to the project, whereas if you sort of end in the void here, you're sort of just looking at it and you kind of miss the project that is here. So it's something to keep in mind. I'm not really sure about the people. Well, at least this one, it is a little bit weird to, well, a couple of things that are weird about her is that she's like, there's a problem with the opacity, there's a problem with the blur. I'm not a huge fan of motion blur, especially for like this kind of picture. I would basically get rid of her, but if you really want to keep her, at least have like a proper opacity, and be careful because the shadow is much darker than it should be, because as you can see here, the difference is quite, like the contrast is not much between the light and the dark part. So here would be the same. The shadows here are not really convincing, so you would have to be a little bit careful with that. In terms of detailing, again, if we think about what I was saying before, which would mean like we would have just trees like that, I would frame this thing. It would also mean that once you frame something, you have to detail it properly. Here there's a start because you can see inside the building, but it would be interesting to actually have like a chair, a library, like bookshelves and stuff like that. Maybe a chair or a table or a pendant light, or I don't know. Do something that sort of shows that stuff happens in there. Same goes with here. Here it's quite minimal, so I quite like it. I'm not a huge fan of the post-processing of this curtain here, because I don't know, it doesn't really look like it's sort of like the style of this sort of curtain is quite different from the style of this sort of a contemporary house. So I would go with like normal curtain that would sort of frame what's happening behind, or no curtain at all. There's something also that is a bit odd, is that here you can see that there's reflection, but here we have nothing reflected, which is kind of a shame. It would be interesting to have like a scenery or something that is like like from the context that is reflected in the glazing area, because we have quite large part of the facade that is made of glass. So since it takes quite a bit of space, it has to be dealt with properly. So add like either redo your backdrop so that it reflects properly inside of it, or just post-process an image in this and be careful that your horizon line fits and that the perspective lines align properly. Regarding, if I put this in black and white, you can see that it's a little bit lacking in contrast. Even though you have an overcast sky, you can still have a bit of contrast, and especially have a lot of white. So I think there's something to be done about that. And regarding the colors, I'm not a huge fan of that green, so I think I would tweak it a little bit. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna spend the next 5 minutes just tweaking the image and try to make it look a little bit more like what I would try to achieve if I were doing the image. And then I'll get back to how, like, all the main layers I've created and try to explain to you what was the point and how it adds things to the image. So let's get started. So basically, as you see, what I did was adding a little bit of vertical in the framing. As I said, it would be more interesting to have just the trunk here, and actually have the foliage starting a little bit more up, but I can't do it because the render is already like that. Same goes with here, like if we get rid of these guys, we get a better legibility of the space here. I've changed, sort of burnt a little bit more the sky so that it gets a little bit more this idea of overcast sky. I've changed, I think it's just a matter of dodge and burn. So with the dodge and burn, you can create more variety in your foreground, which is quite interesting. Although you might want to add a little bit of details, but still, this is pretty good. I got rid of the girl here, which was not really useful in my opinion. What else? I added a little bit of sky reflection here. It's really subtle, but it's just because I didn't have any image to do it with a more interesting background, but here is the idea. And I added a little bit, I changed the saturation, because since I changed the curve of the whole thing, because I've seen like the contrast wasn't really good. If you increase the contrast, then the saturation goes up, so I've had to desaturate the whole thing. Since we're in an overcast sun, the saturation is quite low. There's still like maybe a bit of tweaking on the bricks if you want to get your the color right, but it's not uninteresting in that case. And the final thing was a little bit of green with a full filter that I added in the trees because they were a little bit too dark. But of course, it's something you would take much more time to tweak properly because colors are extremely important. I cannot really add anything in the background because the selection would be too complicated, but I would really add like a line of trees or something, like a forest or whatever you can. That sort of make a smooth transition. Be careful when you edit that the contrast you know, the contrast is going to decrease the further you get. So the contrast on this say line of tree you're going to add is going to be less than the contrast in the foreground trees, for example. Here we lost a bit of colors, but that's because my use saturation layer, and that's because I was clone stamping in black and white for some reason. So just don't pay too much attention to the colors in the trees. Anyway, I hope, well, as you can see, a little bit of tweaking can really change quite a bit the thing. And as you can see as well, here we had like everything was the same value, but by contrasting the whole area and having darker parts here, we sort of refocused the area here. And by having a line of sky here, we sort of lead the eye to go to the center of the image on the project. So that's it for today. Hopefully you've learned interesting tips, and I'll see you in the next teardown. Bye guys.
Schneider.